Hello and welcome to the LBD Live Podcast, Conversations Shaping Responsible Military Innovation.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us on the LBD Live Podcast, Conversations Shaping Responsible Military Innovation. My name is Damien Copeland, and I'm the Director of Article 36 Legal. We're an Australian-based international law practice specialising in the legal review of new weapons, means and methods of warfare. Our aim is to bridge the gap between industry-led technical innovation and national legal review processes. So this Lawful by Design live podcast is part of the Lawful by Design initiative, which promotes IHL compliance as part of a responsible innovation framework in the military. These podcasts that are designed to be interactive, and participants are welcome to ask questions at the end. We'll aim for about 40 minutes and then leave around 20 minutes for questions. If you have a question, please just put them in the chat with your first name. This podcast is being recorded and we will load it onto the Article 36 Legal YouTube and Spotify channels. So I'm very excited. Today we have an important discussion about artificial intelligence decision support systems and their use in armed conflict. So these technologies challenge international humanitarian law compliance, raise urgent questions about accountability, oversight, and responsible use. So I'm delighted we have an expert panel, Assistant Professor Jessica Dorsey and Ms. Heidi Kandiel. Let me please introduce them. Jessica is an Assistant Professor of International Law and the Director of the Realities of Algorithmic Warfare Research Platform at the Utrecht University. She's also a GC-REAIM expert and, of course, a Lawful by Design ambassador. Relevantly, she recently co-authored an article with Dr. Marta Bow. The article's titled AI Decision Support Systems in Joint Targeting Cycle, Legal Challenges, Risks, and the Humane Dimension. And I'll put a link to that article in the chat for those who would like to read it. Jessica, thank you and welcome. Next, we have Heidi, who is a legal advisor with the International Committee of the Red Cross, working on legal and humanitarian implications of autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, and other new technologies of warfare, as well as on legal reviews of new weapons. She holds an LLM in International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. Prior to joining the ICRC, she worked in refugee and immigration law in the MENA region. Heidi, thank you so much and welcome. So let's get started on our conversation today to understand some of the risks, challenges and mitigations. So could you firstly explain why the rise of AI in military decision-making is such a critical issue for IHL compliance today? Jessica, would you mind starting off?
Yeah, thanks, Damien. Thanks for having us on. I'm really happy that we can give a spotlight to this issue that I think generally has gone, certainly understudied, certainly unregulated, and I think there's more and more focus on it. So I'm thankful that we can continue that conversation. I think generally, to answer your question, because AI is moving in some respects in the military domain anyways from support tool sort of into the decision-making space, that it reshapes the way that we are thinking about using force, the way that force is being used. And I think this raises huge risks for IHL. If we're fighting at machine speed, essentially, this is faster than humans can oversee in a meaningful way. And I think that this threatens the core pillars of IHL and makes compliance with these pillars like distinction, precautions, and proportionality very difficult. And that also knocks on to make accountability more generally a lot harder.
Yeah. Thank you. Heidi, what's your view?
Thanks, Damien, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. It's a pleasure. It's also always a pleasure to share a panel with Jessica, so it's great to be here. I definitely echo everything that Jessica said, and perhaps to add a bit more or to complement that, we're currently seeing armed forces, like you're saying, invest very heavily in different military applications of AI and related data collection and analysis technologies. And these we're seeing have significant implications in armed conflict. Now, one of the main reasons it's very important that we're discussing today and in other initiatives, AI decision support systems, or AI DSS for short, is the extent of their pervasiveness. AI DSS is perhaps one of the most widespread military applications that we're seeing used today of AI, and their possible uses are very broad. They're now being used to support decisions about who, what, or where to attack, to decisions about who to detain, for how long. They're even providing recommendations on military strategies, troop movements, and trying to predict adversaries' actions, for example. And so it's no longer about a specialized group of people or high-level commanders using those types of systems, but instead, AI DSS is developing the capacity to almost permeate into every aspect of military operations. And yet, despite them being that pervasive, most of the discussions on military applications have so far focused on AI-enabled weapons, and maybe to a lesser extent on AI and cyber, but very little has been said on AI decision support systems. And so I think it's very crucial that we're having this talk today and other initiatives as well, where we talk about the impact of these tools and how, not because they're necessarily flawed, for example, but because we need to be able to think about how we can support IHL compliance and other compliance with legal obligations from the design stage, which I know is something you both focus on in your work a lot.
Absolutely. And so in terms of the military's increased investment in this sort of technology, at least on a par, if not more, as compared to autonomous systems, where do you see the role of human judgment in their use? Jessica?
Yeah, well, where I see it is different from where I think it should be. I want to make sure that we're keeping it central. Like, it has to stay at the core for many reasons. Certainly from a legal perspective, it's what anchors decisions in ethics, but also legal analysis. AI can process the data fast, but only humans can weigh the contextual, the intent, the consequences in the qualitative ways, right? These systems are often quantitative in nature, and I'll get into that perhaps a little later. But I think understanding what kind of cognitive requirements are necessary to make life and death decisions, that needs to remain central to human, because this is high-level cognitive skills that machines are absolutely not capable of now, nor will they be in the future.
Absolutely. Heidi, what's your view?
I completely echo what Jessica said, and perhaps where I'd like to start is focusing on the emphasis that Jessica put on central. At the ICRC, we follow what we call a human-centered approach to AI, which builds on exactly what Jessica's talking about. That essentially entails that when we are looking at those types of military applications, we focus on the humans that are affected by the use of AI and those who use or order the use of AI and their obligations and responsibilities as such. And so we consider human judgment to be quite crucial for reducing humanitarian risks, addressing ethical concerns, and ensuring compliance with legal obligations, including IHL obligations. Now, I just wanted to take this as a chance to also elaborate further on this issue of human judgment and control, because for us, we see this as a guiding principle. And how this takes effect will definitely depend on the different military application of AI you're talking about. So, for example, if we look at autonomous weapon systems, human judgment and control does not need to be direct physical control over the system at all stages of its life cycle. Instead, it's more about having control over a weapon system's effects to be able to ensure that it will comply with IHL obligations in the circumstances of a specific attack, for example. Now, conversely, when it comes to AI decision support systems, and despite the growing reliance on AI technology, it's very important that we emphasize this centrality of human in decision-making that Jessica talked about, and the idea that IHL obligations bind humans, not machines. It's humans that must determine the lawfulness of the attacks that they plan, decide upon, and execute, and they remain accountable for those determinations.
Thank you. So let's zoom in a little bit closer on this issue. Obviously, they are a support tool for commanders and operators. How do they balance the AI's inputs with qualitative skills like legal reasoning in complex decision-making processes, such as the F2T2EA and JTC, which we might need to explain. Heidi, do you want to start off with that one?
Sure. So I'll focus more broadly, perhaps, on the balance between quantitative and qualitative that Jessica hinted at a bit, and then Jessica can come in on the joint targeting cycles and the fixed find and the rest of the list when it comes to the kill chain. So building on what I was saying earlier, the idea or the balance comes in the sense that the legal determinations on whether an attack complies with IHL or not requires context-specific assessments, and those legal determinations must be done by humans. To give an example, when we look at the principle of distinction, it requires the users to be able to distinguish at all times between civilian objects and military objectives, and direct their attacks at the latter. Now, this requires assessing whether, for example, an object makes an effective contribution to military action, and whether its destruction or neutralization at the time offers a definite military advantage. Now, there is no set formula on how to calculate these things that you can then program into a machine. Instead, they require an assessment of the context. It's a value-based judgment, essentially. And this is even more so the case with assessing whether someone is directly participating in hostilities or not, especially because their status can change very quickly. And so would the determination of whether they're a lawful target or not would also change very quickly. The same applies to the principle of proportionality. It also requires a value-based judgment. It's not an X number of combatants versus X number of civilians that you can put into a machine. It's not a numerical indicator. It's a question of degree that's often very much subjective and highly imprecise and really depends on the context. Now, and to bring it back to your question a bit on the balance, this does not mean that commanders and soldiers cannot use those AI tools. We're already seeing computerized tools being used to conduct things like collateral damage estimations, or, for example, calculating the blast radius of a munition. But these are not the legal determination of whether an attack is proportionate or not. Instead, these are just sources of information, if you will, aside from other ISR sources of information, or computational indicators that the user can then use as part of their decision-making process in determining whether an attack is going to be proportionate, whether it's going to comply with distinction or not. And so, to put it simply, the outputs of the system can be used by the human user, but the legal determinations of whether something complies with IHL or not, an attack complies with IHL or not, must remain with the human decision maker.
Thank you. Jessica.
Yeah, I think dovetailing on what Heidi said there, I think, and also making it a bit more operational or practical in a sense. That's why we chose in the article that you mentioned by Marta Bo and myself to look at the joint targeting cycle. So that's the 6-step process, largely spoken. I mean, every country has a different approach to this, perhaps, but we adopt basically the NATO approach, the US approach, but understanding 6 steps. The first is the commander's objectives. The second is target development and prioritization. Then it's capabilities analysis. Then the commander's decision and force assignment in step 4. Step 5 is the mission planning and force execution, and then step 6 is assessment. So it's written in a circle, but it's certainly not a linear. There are times at which you'll need to revert back to other steps within the joint targeting cycle. So as you can start seeing, these 6 steps entail a lot of context. There's a lot of context necessary and highly cognitive, high-level cognitive skills in order to, for example, when you're developing a target and when you're prioritizing it. If you understand a particular individual or an object to be a high-level target, you have to understand how to balance that across your strategic goals, etc. This is not something a machine based on predictive analytics can do for you, right? So to farm some of that out is very difficult. There are other steps within the process that require positive identification. So certainly highlighting what Heidi just said about someone who might be directly participating in hostilities, but then their behavior changes, that requires a reassessment at that time. So just seeing a generated list of names on a targeting list, for example, that's one highly discussed example. It's also something we focus on in the article that you mentioned, looking at the way that those lists end up on a name that doesn't do your legal work for you, right? That's not enough. And so to understand that these systems can indeed act as advisors, but they're not authorities, right? I think that's really important. The inputs can sharpen some aspects of speed or precision. And I'm really sympathetic to why militaries want that. But at the same time, the final decisions, especially in these complex processes, like the find, fix, track, target, engage, assess. So that's sort of what happens at all levels of the joint targeting cycle, but certainly in dynamic targeting. When things are moving fast, it doesn't excuse you from your requirements under precautions to minimize or to avoid or to any extent minimize civilian harm to the most feasible extent before we even get into proportionality assessments and weighing the legal obligations. So I think that these contextual awareness situations, algorithms cannot replicate what we humans are extraordinarily good at and legally required to do.
So, Jess, you've written about this idea of cognitive shifting in the context of IHL. So could you explain what this means and why it matters for rules like precautions, proportionality in relation to targeting decisions?
Yeah, sure. Look, I'm not a psychologist. I fancy myself perhaps an amateur psychologist. I find it fascinating to delve into that discipline, even though it's not my own. I think it's important that we're thinking about it. If we're thinking about decision making, the cognitive psychologist should be definitely at the table. So I'm trying to work with colleagues as well to understand a bit more about how we make decisions, what kind of parts of that process might be able to be aided by AI-enabled systems, but what won't be able to. So what we're seeing with this cognitive shifting is that these technologies, I think I mentioned earlier, are shifting the way that we think and interact with the environment around us. So extracting this from the military sector or the domain, this is everywhere, right? This is when I am overly reliant on a calculator because I can't do math in long form, or I choose not to. I can probably. I learned it once upon a time. But I've never checked the math on my calculator, right? I'm overly reliant on that because I've learned to trust that particular system. But the stakes are not so high when I'm filing my taxes as they are on a battlefield when we're talking about life and death, right? So when operators in this context start trusting machine outputs too readily, that may narrow the focus to only what the system highlights. And they sometimes liken it to the fact that these systems spit out recommendations of situational awareness. But essentially that equates to kind of looking at the world through a straw. You're only seeing what is being recommended to you, and we don't quite know what else might be out there. So instead of stepping back to assess the bigger picture, we're looking through that straw. And I think that's a real concern. Certainly, my work has highlighted the concerns about precautions and proportionality. I have another article right now under review looking at the joint targeting cycle and the knock-on effects in proportionality assessments. These demand nuanced, context-specific judgment, right? And if human decision makers stop questioning or supplementing AI inputs with other intelligence or ISR or other on-the-ground human intelligence, etc., they risk overlooking alternative options or, in the worst case scenario, in my view, underestimating civilian harm. And I think this undermines the very legal obligations, of course, the rules are meant to uphold. So talking a bit more concretely of what we're seeing or what we're worried about, Marta and I, in our article, we warn of the effects of algorithmic bias, automation bias, and action bias. So that certainly that last one is a bit understudied or not quite highlighted enough, I think. But the idea is that these systems generate options for humans to action, to engage, and then that is something cognitively, it's a heuristic that we humans have the sort of tendency to act when in some cases actually inaction was the better option, right? Slowing down, integrating tactical patience. This is something Heidi's colleague Georgia Hines wrote about a couple years ago, understanding that sometimes slowing it down gives us a better situational awareness and a better ability to ground our legal analysis. And I think we need that because I think when we get caught up in the speed and scale of things, just because we can doesn't always mean we should. And I think that gets lost at times. And I think that's the hard truth here in this quest for finding an edge over the adversary. Sometimes no is the right answer. And sometimes not using the technologies in these ways should be the way forward. I'll leave it there for now, but we can return to it if people have questions. You're on mute though, Damien. That's all right.
Sorry. Thank you, Jessica. That's fascinating and very useful. I think the looking through the straw analogy is very powerful, and it gives a really good sense of some of the risks in terms of the ability to exercise judgment and cognitive functions in these important decisions around precautions and proportionality. So let's move now to speed. So AI-enabled systems, we all know that they promise unprecedented speed and scale. But what kind of risks does this present from a legal, ethical, even operational perspective, especially when decisions need to comply with IHL? Heidi, can I start with you?
Absolutely. So I think you're definitely right, Damien, that we're often hearing now that AI is driven by the so-called need for speed, which is touted as one of the main military benefits of AI. However, and as Jessica hinted, when it comes to tactical patience and slowing down, that is really key. Increasing speed of military decisions can offer a military advantage, but however, it brings with it a risk of loss of control over the use of force, which can heighten risks of miscalculation and potentially even escalation. For example, if we look at autonomous weapon systems, an autonomous weapon system may falsely detect a signal and erroneously launch a counter missile, for example. Whereas if you have human judgment involved, and if the speed of the operation was slower, a human could have foreseen that error or could have realized that the signal was erroneous and avoided launching a counter missile. Now, our experience based on previous conflicts, and as Georgia indeed wrote recently in an article, shows that higher tempo military operations do pose additional risks for civilians and for combatants. And militaries themselves have recognized this by integrating concepts like tactical patience, which Jessica was talking about, into their civilian casualty prevention guidance. And so essentially, they are looking, and militaries do see the benefit of deliberately slowing down aspects of the planning and decision-making process. And so it's also crucial that AI DSS users understand that the outputs that AI DSS provide are not neutral representation of the environment. They have their challenges and limitations, including challenges when it comes to the availability of data, whether it's ethically sourced or not, the reliability of it as well, system limitations, which Jessica hinted about, whether it's about systemic biases or, for example, malfunctions, errors, the so-called black box effect, and human-machine interaction-related challenges. And all of those can be exacerbated by an increase in speed. For example, if operations are too fast, the risks that are presented in human-machine interaction-related issues that Jessica talked about, whether that's automation bias and an over-reliance on the machine, or action bias, like Jessica said, those will be much more heightened because the user or the operator is forced to make a decision very quickly that they're not taking the time to process that information and compare it with other obligations or the other checklists that they need to be going through. And then finally, the use of AI DSS, and this is something I really want to stress on, it cannot fix targeting methodologies that are otherwise not compliant with IHL. If you apply, for example, AI DSS in the context of overly permissive or otherwise problematic targeting parameters, the system will not only replicate and exacerbate the unlawful or harmful outcomes, but it will likely do so at a much wider scale or at a much larger scale and at a much faster rate. So that even if the human operator or user, whatever word we're choosing today, wanted to intervene, they're not going to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think mitigations could include matching speed with checks and balances in processes. Jessica, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Heidi certainly taking that last point and expanding a bit more on what kinds of pre-programmed problems we're seeing also. I mean, I think that the way I conceptualize it in this article that I just mentioned, it's under review right now, within proportionality assessments, understanding the kinds of information that's being sort of used is this longer trajectory, in my view, of I trace it from the Vietnam War all the way through network-centric warfare doctrine in the 90s, through the global war on terror, all the way up to today. And I see AI decision support systems as an extension of what I term here the quantification logics, understanding, thinking that we can quantify everything, and that we can connect everything to everything else through data and systems. Again, I'm very sympathetic to understanding, wanting to have sort of the eye in the sky, the understanding of the entire situation, but I'm not sure that that's able to be done. I'm not convinced that that's able to be done by datifying everything. And certainly one specific and concrete example of how those cognitive shifts I mentioned earlier, how we're seeing those replicate themselves, and as Heidi said, at speed and scale. So when you start with a misunderstanding of your legal obligations and then you exacerbate them through new technologies, that bifurcation is what we're seeing, I think, in this particular case. And what that is something the US referred to as the non-combatant casualty cutoff value, so the NCV. This is something that the US used in the war on terror, and they would set a level of acceptable civilian harm before it had to be then sent up the chain. Who would have to approve particular strikes? Oftentimes, if the level was set to 0 for civilian harm, acceptable civilian harm in a proportionality assessment, then they would have to, if they were going to have a number that was higher than that, they would have to send it up the chain of command. And the essence of that was to minimize civilian harm. However, when you start anchoring numbers and you're quantifying, these are human lives. When you move that metric from 0 to 10, or to 20, to 30, or 100, for example, the US used 30 as an acceptable civilian harm rate for Osama bin Laden. So understanding civilian harm versus military necessity, the proportionality assessment, that's what they were willing to accept with such a high level target. But when you start using numbers like this and plugging them in for lower level targets in different conflicts, for example, there are reports that the IDF is using these metrics to assess whether or not they can kill low-level targets, and they would accept perhaps 20 or 50 or 100. When we start quantifying the acceptable civilian harm, this cognitively shifts how we think about our legal obligations. We no longer see it, I think, as civilian harm that's problematic, and we have every requirement to minimize, or to any extent, or to avoid, or to any extent minimize, but rather it's in this case quantifiably and perhaps algorithmically justified. And we anchor that, and that's what I term the anchoring bias, or look at the anchoring bias. When you start accepting that that's the level that we can accept as a general society or a legal assessment, that shifts what we understand as civilian harm. It shifts what we see as the value of human lives. And I think these are the dangers within quantification logics, and then the speed and scale, back to the original question, is what makes this so incredibly dangerous. And we can see the effects of the devastation that it can do at speed and scale when you start eschewing your responsibilities to protect civilians in favor of calling everything militarily necessary. I think that that is the real issue. ICRC, again, not to sing too many of your praises, but I'm going to do it. In the challenges report from last fall, you highlight and you bifurcate that issue, I think, and I think that's done very well. It's not just the technology. I'm often faced with critique of, hey, yeah, but it's not the technology that's the problem here, but it's the bifurcation of the issue, which is a very misunderstood or out of balance understanding of what IHL requires, and then the new technologies that exacerbate it. So the idea that guns don't kill people, people kill people, I understand that, but people with guns, certainly like AK-47s or automatic rifles, can kill more people if they want to do that than people with perhaps a knife or another weapon, right? So I think understanding the socio-technical realities and the socio-legal realities of these systems, I think that's really important. And we can only do that when we have a more interdisciplinary group of experts around the table. So I'll stop now for now. I could do this all day, as you see.
That's wonderful, Jessica. And so I think we can clearly recognize that the use of these, the AI decision support systems, raise a range of IHL compliance challenges and risks. So what steps can be taken to mitigate these risks? So, for example, how might approaches like lawful by design or And congratulations, Jessica, on today's release of the GC Reaim report, Responsible by Design. How can these systems call for compliance to be built in throughout the life cycle of AI systems, shape regulation, procurement, and industry practice? So can I start with you, Jessica? How do such things help mitigate risks with AI systems?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the shout out on the new report. I hope maybe I can convince you that to add a link to that particular report. Now it's out there. It was officially launched yesterday at the UN General Assembly by our Dutch Prime Minister, Dick Schoof. So it's out there, and it's something now that people can use as a stepping stone, and I hope they will, because we do outline several ways to mitigate, and a lot of it has to do, certainly, thank you for that, lawful by design, but responsible by design. That what we're trying to evoke here, the approach is that you need to be thinking about this much earlier than it seems people have been thinking about it. And I do think it's about embedding the law. It's about embedding ethics where possible, but considering law, considering ethics across the entire life cycle. And sometimes it's not going to be possible to build law in. The law cannot be coded in, right? Or ethics may not be able to be coded in. So we have to also be clear-eyed about those realities and those shortcomings. I think that starting from day one to think about it, that's the first step, is to raise awareness. And I think you've done a great job launching the initiative of Lawful by Design to bring the multi-stakeholders into the discussion. I think that's the other step, not only thinking about it throughout the life cycle, but having a huge amount of people with knowledge, expertise, and skin in the game, as it were, at the table to have conversations about it. Because I don't have the right answer. I don't know the checklist right now. We're all figuring that out as we go. And I think that's really important that we tailor make this as technology advances, as we start seeing how it's being integrated. And that's why we run the realities of algorithmic warfare, understanding not just the promises of this stuff, but how it's actually being used. And that, I think, echoes nicely about the effects-based regime and the human-centric notion. How are these systems being used? And how can we ensure that they are compliant with law? And I think that has to be done. The last thing I want to say is that I think it requires states to reassert their primacy, in a sense, to say, like, we are the contractors here. We are going to procure particular systems from private companies, et cetera, but we are on the hook when it comes to legal responsibility. And therefore, we need to see demonstrated compliance before procurement and not after. It's not an afterthought. And I think that that's also echoed in our Global Commission report. And I hope that this is gaining traction across the board.
Thanks, Jessica. And that report link is in the chat for those that are interested. Congratulations again. I think GC Reaim, the ICRC play a critical role in broadening and deepening the conversations around the need for building compliance in rather than bolting it on at the end of an acquisition process. So Heidi, can I invite your view on this issue?
Absolutely. Thanks, Damien. So I very much agree with this concept that now we're seeing in many initiatives, including the one led by you, Damien, about this lawful by design. And the idea is that, or the way I see it, is that those systems are built with intentionality. When we're designing those systems, we have to be cognizant of all the obligations that we have. And so from the development, from the design, from the conception phase of those systems, we need to be able to design them with the idea in mind that the users are going to be able to comply with the obligations when they have those systems. And so one key point for us that I've been going on about, and I hope I'm not sounding more like a broken record now, but is the centrality of the human in the decision making. And the idea, like I said, and the main I perhaps takeaway that we constantly push is that AI DSS tools can be used to support, but must never hinder or replace human decision-making. And so to that effect, and the idea of how we can mitigate the risks we talked about and the limitations that I talked about in the prior questions, we've developed a set of 16 preliminary recommendations that we've annexed to our UN Secretary General submission that we sent last April. And those recommendations are essentially not just for states, they're for developers and users of AI DSS in general. And so they also address private companies, academics, researchers, and all those involved in a way in the development, testing, or use of AI DSS. And so essentially, those recommendations, like I said, have the overall goal of preserving human judgment in military decision-making when it comes to the use of force and detention in armed conflict. And they include a wide range of things. They include things like developing the interfaces and platforms in a way where the user is presented the information in a coherent manner, and so they're not overwhelmed. It includes things like ensuring proper testing, evaluation, verification, and validation cycles, conducting robust legal reviews, acquiring reliable and ethically sourced data, being aware of the system's limitations as well as the biases, and developing ways to mitigate or correct these biases. We also have specific proposed restriction on use cases, and one of the most prominent of those is the idea that we should not have AI DSS, for example, propose recommendations on who to target that then feed directly into an autonomous weapon system with a human being completely removed, not just a human not in the loop, but a human outside the loop completely. And so other things also include conducting user training and having after-action reviews that constantly and consistently guide the development of those systems. And so essentially, these recommendations provide operational measures in a sense, whether that's through development or through use, that allow to mitigate the risks and limitations that we talked about, whether that's, again, system limitations, data, or human-machine interaction-related issues.
Thanks, Heidi. So can I move to, I think, perhaps the final question so we can leave some time for some participant questions?
Can I just
Please.
quickly? I loved how she walked that out. Thank you, Heidi, for that. I think one thing we should also be doing is, I think I termed it once, intention creep, understanding that certain systems might be delivered and developed for a particular purpose, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. But then with a small tweak, they can also be used in a way that can fulfill other requirements within the joint targeting cycle. They weren't developed for that. Yeah. So therefore, in essence, they might not have been legally reviewed for that. But once that intention creep sets in and we see it being used for a different purpose, or in machine learning particular cases where it's doing something we didn't know that it ought to do, we need to re-trigger those review processes. And I think that that's sort of the depth we need to get into. And that's what my fellow ambassadors and I, Zaina Assad, Neil Rennick, and Ingvild Bode and I, with the help of our amazing student ambassador, Flora, we're setting out sort of a research agenda about how this is going to look from all of these different disciplinary angles, but understanding when the rubber meets the road, when these things start to change within these new contexts as means and methods, when do we need to step in and do these new kinds of review requirements?
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. And I can see in the chat already, we've got a question about legal reviews, which I absolutely can't wait to discuss. But I guess just to conclude the panel discussion, if you were to give one piece of advice to either policymakers, military leaders, or industry designers about building AI systems that are capable of use in compliance with IHL, what would it be? Heidi.
I would say it's very hard to sum everything up into one piece of advice, but I shall try. And I think other than having humans central in decision making, I think if there's one piece of advice, it would be that when we're designing and using those systems, we have to think about their suitability and fitness for purpose. And I quite like that a lot. It's something that was proposed by Dr. Heidi Kandiel, the idea of fitness for purpose, which is not just relevant from a technical perspective, but also from a legal perspective as well. There are simply things that a machine cannot do, that the machine is not suitable for. And so before jumping into how a specific military application of AI can be used, including how AI DSS can be used, what are the military advantage, how much faster it can make things, we need to pause and ask ourselves first whether they should even be used in the first place in a particular application. And this will depend on things that we've discussed today, like, is there quality representative data? Is the task that is something clear with carefully defined parameters, or is it something that's open-ended, which requires an understanding of the context?
No, that's a great point. So having a a clear set of requirements in terms of development, but then also matching that with a verification process to make sure it meets those requirements. Jessica, your final piece of advice.
Yeah, thanks. Not to get too philosophical here. Again, just an amateur philosopher here. But I've been doing a lot of thinking about this. I actually just finished up my first draft of my PhD manuscript, which is entitled Keeping Our Humanity, looking at these issues about, these are real existential issues we're wrestling with. And so I think my piece of advice would be, to those designers, developers, and procurers of these technologies, like I think we need to be designing for legality and accountability as if our lives depend on it, because they do. And I think that this is how it ties into, and this is also our chair of the GC Reaim in his foreword talked about, we need to be harnessing the control over AI before it controls us. And I don't want to stop on a downer note, but I do think this is the choice that we're faced with right now. We're at a crossroads, and we have the ability to shape it in a way that is fully compliant with law, that is fully in line with our ethics and our norms and our values. But we have to take that chance. And if we don't, I am afraid we're gonna, that the trade-off is bits and pieces of our humanity, who we are as humans.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that was one of the powerful messages coming out of the Austrian conference last year, the Oppenheimer moment. So thank you. And so that concludes our panel discussion. And I'm so grateful for Jessica and Heidi for giving us their time. I've learned so much today from two experts on the issue. I commend anyone that hasn't read the ICRC's work or Jessica's latest piece with Marta Bow to please take the time to do so. Of course, follow that up quite quickly with the GC Reaim Responsible by Design report, freshly released and presented to the UN General Assembly today. So that's quite exciting. So it's time now for our panel questions, and we have one question I can see from Andrea, and I like this question, and perhaps I might start with Heidi because it falls well within her remit within the ICRC. Do states have an obligation to legally review AI DSS prior to their use?
Thanks, Damien. Always interesting to bring legal reviews into the discussion indeed, so I'm very happy with that question as well. So at the ICRC, we see carrying out effective legal reviews as a necessary step to ensure the state's armed forces' ability to comply with IHL obligations. This is an obligation for states party to Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, and we also see it as a requirement that also flows from the obligation to ensure respect for IHL. Now, specifically on AI decision support systems, states must conduct legal reviews of AI DSS, where they either form parts of a weapon system or are used as a means or method of warfare. Now, we also try to take it a step further and recommend that states consider conducting legal reviews of all AI decision support systems involved in military decisions to use force, detain, or intern in armed conflict at a minimum as a matter of, let's say, policy or good practice.
Thank you. Wonderful answer, Heidi, which I completely agree with. And Jessica, you mentioned earlier, so we've just covered the obligation prior to use, but of course, once it's introduced into service, it could potentially, its use could change, and that may trigger a need for a further legal review. So do you want to add to that anymore, or you've already covered it quite well, but any other thoughts?
Yeah, early and often. Yeah. And when in doubt, legally review. And I think this is good practice. I think it's also something that feeds into I don't know, from a market perspective, from an industry perspective, if you can demonstrate compliance or your willingness to revisit this compliance and tweak it for compliance, that's also just good business, right? Countries should be lining up to buy systems that are able to do this, right? And this is why industries can be leaders in this space to demonstrate that compliance prior to procurement, but then also the willingness to revisit it as these systems change, develop, and their use changes and develops on a battlefield.
Thank you. I completely agree. Those that might be interested, my book on the functional approach to legal review addresses this issue, both in terms of the requirement to review and also the re-review use. So thank you. That's all the questions we have now. So if there's no more, what I might do
Damien,
is...
I actually wanted to take this chance
please.
and perhaps to touch on something that Jessica said earlier, because Jessica, I found it quite interesting when you said those AI tools can be used as advisors. And I guess I wanted to, not to put you too much on the spotlight, but to perhaps ask you to elaborate on that a bit. Because, for example, in my opinion, I would avoid using the term advisors because that sort of anthropomorphizes those tools in a sense. And it's also raises particular concerns for me because we're seeing some very alarming trends of certain scholars saying that JAGs, for example, or military lawyers can be now replaced by AI, which we would definitely highly caution against. And so perhaps I would say they should be used as tools, or ISR, or other, again, sources of information that should always be double checked. But yeah, I guess I wanted to ask you to elaborate on that further if possible.
It's good. I think I'm so glad you did, because certainly I don't want to anthropomorphize these things. These are machines. These are tools indeed. I think in an advisory capacity, maybe would have been a more careful, nuanced way. Understanding that whatever is coming out, whatever is being generated by these particular systems are things for humans to then use and carry forward. But again, I think you mentioned also the collateral damage estimation methodologies that are already in place. These are examples I also look at in my work. We're already using these tools, and indeed they're tools, they're not advisory. So, but they generate information in some respect for humans then to take and make decisions. But I think that's the order in which we need to be understanding it. And again, that discussion around the worldview through a straw, understanding that it's just perhaps a very narrow understanding of what a battlefield looks like. And that's why when commanders in the past, prior to AI DSS, but when they're making proportionality assessments, collateral damage estimation methodologies were one part of the ex-ante analysis, but never the only part, right? And that's the responsible approach to assessing proportionality, using that tool to inform particular things. But collateral damage estimation methodologies have shortcomings. They do not, for example, include secondary effects or reverberating effects, etc., from secondary explosions in certain cases. You'll need to augment that with human intelligence or other intelligence sources. So that one tool, just like DSS, but I think my main concern is that it's shifting toward over-reliance on the systems and the recommendations because of those quantification logics. And I think that we need to be very clear-eyed and wrestle with how to eliminate or mitigate risks. And that can be done through training. It could be done through a lot of things. But you're so right. Do not replace the humans with the machines, please. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think, Jessica, you've hit the right word there. They're tools. So I guess making sure that we don't I can't say that word. We're just having some people join the panel, and so for those that have just joined us, I need to perhaps offer an apology. I advertised the incorrect time for the Australian audience. And so if you're from Australia or in our time zone and just logging on now, my humble apologies. And this will be loaded onto the YouTube channel fairly soon. So you won't miss out on this absolutely powerful and engaging conversation by two clear experts on this topic. So this podcast, the Lawful by Design podcast, is scheduled for every second Thursday at the same time. Of course, as long as I get the time zone right. And so, as I said, the videos will be available on the Article 36 Legal YouTube and Spotify channels. Our next podcast is scheduled for Thursday, the 9th of October. And so we will advertise the topic mid next week. We're still confirming our speakers. And we look forward to you joining us then. So to conclude, a very warm thank you to our panelists. This has been a wonderful discussion. I've really enjoyed it. Jessica, Heidi, thank you so much. And good night or good day to those that have joined us online.